everyone. How are you feeling? Excited? Good. I'm very excited. My name is Fareed Mostofi, and I'm the Senior Education Manager here at the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. And I have the privilege today of introducing our guests, Peter DiCampo and Austin Merrill, to talk about Everyday Africa and the many incredible projects that have stemmed from that, including an education program here in DC. So the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism organization. We're in our 11th year this year, and our mission is to encourage connection, curiosity about global issues that are pressing and underrepresented, and we do that by supporting journalism. So journalists out there, we provide grants for reporting projects. Please check our site if you are interested in learning more about that. But we also want to extend the life of our journalists' work through outreach and education events. So today we have this outreach event. These gentlemen have also been a part of, I think, between them 8 or 9 education events throughout the day. They were together seeing, I think they saw 8 DC public and DC public charter schools today, and by the end of the week we'll have seen 20. So thank you, gentlemen. Yeah. So in our education department here, we hope to extend the life of our journalists' work through creating curriculum that you can find on our site. So tell your teacher friends to check out our Lesson Builder, which is an online free platform that uses our journalism to explore a variety of different techniques and standards. We also do a lot of in-person engagements with the journalists and have had the pleasure of working really closely with some education partners to develop deeper projects. And today, we're going to celebrate, as a part of this presentation, one of our DC projects, which was the Everyday DC unit and exhibition. It was developed in using curriculum that the team developed with Pulitzer Center and teachers across the country and across the world. That curriculum was adapted by the Visual Arts Department of DC Public Schools into a unit that teaches composition, curation, interview, and also visual literacy as students examine not only how the images from Everyday Africa change their perceptions of the continent, but also gets them thinking about how Washington, D.C. is represented in the media and how they feel about that, and how they could be applying photography to challenge, or maybe I should say diversify, the conversation in the media about DC. So we're really privileged to have representatives from DCPS here. Christy worked really closely with us. You can give her a round of applause. And she worked with me and our team and 7 middle school teachers last year to deliver the unit aligned to DC Public School standards in their schools. And then those students submitted photos that we gave to 3 other middle school students who curated them with a member of our staff, and that became an exhibit of over 100 photos representing the work of over 80 students in 7 middle schools. And it was up for a month and seen by over 1,000 people. So that was a really exciting thing last year. And all of that was made possible by the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. We have representatives from there as well here today. And their support has also kicked us off this year with that unit plan, inspired by Peter and Austin's work, has become a cornerstone unit, meaning upwards of 15 schools are going to be looking at that unit this year. In fact, they're meeting with 10 of them this week to get them started with that unit. So please keep following our education work. And here in DC, in January 2018, look out for the second annual Everyday DC exhibition. So all of that is to say that this is inspired by these 2 gentlemen who are now going to take the floor, and I think we should welcome them with a big round of applause.
It's weird to not hold the mic, but everyone can hear me, right? Thank you so much. This is really fantastic and amazing. There is an element to this of feeling like we've come full circle a little bit. I'm going to talk about this more, but Everyday Africa was started on a Pulitzer Center travel grant, during which we were reporting a completely different story, and started this project by accident, which I'm never supposed to say, but oh well, here we are. And Pulitzer Center from that time has been incredibly supportive of it. There's an entire staff of people at the Pulitzer Center thank, so thank you all. I mean, as Bree just mentioned, the education portion of this would not have happened without their support and their knowledge and their enthusiasm. There are exhibitions they've supported. There are moments like right now. So we are really indebted and really thrilled to be here. Yeah, I mean, there's many other people in this room that have contributed in many ways. Our sort of Nat Geo friends are here who have been big, distributed the project in many ways, featured the project in many ways, and so thank you for that. And I can really just go on and on.
My parents are here.
Yeah, awesome. And thanks everyone for coming tonight and joining us. And I mean, a brief word on the Everyday DC program. I mean, I think a lot of journalists specifically, we end up doing what we do, hoping to make some kind of impact, and we very often have no idea if that's the case. And so it's really a dream come true to see it in the school system. We're in many schools across the country and to a degree across the world, but DC is the first place where we've really been integrated into a citywide school system. So a big thanks to the DC Public Schools. Thank you. So speaking of school visits, this is very much the reason that we do what we do. So we start each of the Everyday Africa school visits by asking the students, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Africa? And here we go. And this is very much a common example of that. This was the first one in which someone just said bad right off the bat. First word is bad. But we often get hunger, poverty, scarce resources, war. Those are very common. And then you see giraffe at the bottom. Like one kid says an animal, and all of the rest of the kids are like, "Oh yeah, animals!" And then they run through the zoo, naming every animal they can think of. Speaking of what we've been doing here in DC, this is from a classroom Austin visited earlier today, showing very much the same kind of list. Do you remember what school it was?
Deal, is that right? Okay. Yeah, it was Deal, I think, right?
Yeah. So, Mills. So, backing up a little bit, so this is the first Everyday Africa picture. And as a photographer, it's a funny one to show so many times over and over again because it's not exactly the best picture I've ever taken, but it was the first Everyday Africa one. We were traveling in Ivory Coast. Both of us had lived as Peace Corps volunteers in West Africa prior to that, and had both at different parts of our lives lived in West Africa for years at a time as freelance journalists. And so we went to Ivory Coast in March of 2012 to look at 1 year after the end of their civil war, how were things returning to normal, what issues were they still having, etc. This is the grant we got from Pulitzer Center. This is what we had sort of pitched to magazines and newspapers, etc. And when we got there, we almost right away started feeling like we had sort of imposed this narrative on ourselves and started literally and figuratively shooting our way out of the box, trying to take other pictures with our phones that felt more familiar to us as people who had lived there and are perhaps more relatable. We were in an elevator on the first day we were there, in an elevator up to get our press passes in a government building, and I just sort of saw this symmetry happening and thought, I'll shoot a photo of that, but I didn't want to lift my Lumia 6 out of my bag, and so I shot it with the iPhone, and right away we realized that was sort of a very freeing way to do it. I mean, this was in 2012, and it was a bit earlier in journalistic, using the iPhone as a serious device. So moving out through the reporting trip, I found myself very much shooting things that were, sticking to that narrative with the big film camera, and then both of us were shooting things, sort of trying to free ourselves from any thought narrative with our iPhones. So that included things like the woman at the front desk at the hotel, or coffee in the morning, this kind of thing. A couple of quick examples. So we happened to be there while hundreds of refugees who had been living in neighboring Liberia were being brought back to their homes by the UN for the first time in a year. So we hopped into the car and accompanied those refugees home. This line of white cars that you see in both pictures is the sort of convoy taking the refugees home. And on the left is me shooting my big, expensive film camera, and I think I don't know how well you can see it, but this sort of like child hanging over her mother's arms, African child looking off into the distance, uncertain future. I mean, to me, this is me thinking, trying to use the language I had learned as a news photographer and doing it in a way that I think is relatively stereotypical. On the right is the same exact scenario, but it's a roadside DVD seller. The refugees are using their UN repatriation money to buy action film DVDs before they head back to their homes. Here on the left, you have a destroyed home that I photographed. On the right, one of Austin's photos, the guy with the Adidas shirt, which the kids love.
They really did every time today.
Right?
Adidas.
Austin started interviewing this guy about the things that had happened in this village and how the village was still divided between the factions of the war, blah, blah, blah. But he lived in Abidjan in the city, and he was just back for a visit, and he just was talking to Austin about the music he listened to, the nightclubs he went to, that completely sort of ignoring the narrative we were trying to sort of impose. On the left, you have a woman who was a victim of gender-based violence, sexual violence during the war, and using, again, that sort of relatively stereotypical photojournalism language of silhouetting her, protecting her identity, of course, but it's a trope we've seen many times. And on the right is Austin's picture of, again, the woman at the front desk. So we got back from that trip and realized we were sort of onto something. I actually posted a bunch of those photos as a Facebook album, and it got this weirdly large response. And the words Everyday Africa came up almost right away, and we realized we had a project on our hands. So if you fast forward a bit, we joined Instagram. We invited other photographers to join us from across the continent. And now it is 35 photographers sharing what daily life looks like in many, many forms.
So the list of words that Peter was showing earlier, from the bad, poverty, dry giraffe, and the one from this morning, it's not an attempt to try to make the kids say something wrong or say something that sounds stupid. It's just an attempt to try to get them to say something quickly that allows us some access into the first thing you think of, which allows us a chance to sort of see and look into what really is the first thing you think of when you think of that part of the world. But as Peter's been saying, those aren't the stories we're trying to tell. So if those aren't the stories we're trying to tell, what stories are we trying to tell? Am I doing something wrong? What stories are we trying to tell? Well, we're trying to say that in Africa, people play in marching bands. And they go to work. And they rollerblade. And play in swimming pools. And get married. And play with toy airplanes. And they study for exams. And they enjoy sporting events. And care about fashion. And they play golf. And they go to concerts. And they care about art. They go to the beach. Take photographs of their friends at the beach. And they do laundry. And pose for the school yearbook. And they vote in elections. And play polo. And they celebrate one-year wedding anniversaries. And they audition for movies. And go fishing. And they stare at solar eclipses. Any of those scenes could have been taken anywhere in the world. This was a pretty popular scene around these parts just a few weeks ago. When I went through this slideshow today at one of the middle schools, I'd never heard this before, but it was kind of the kids got into this kind of rhythm with it. And as I was going through, I would say, and they posed for the yearbook, and this one kid started saying, just like we do. And they vote in elections, and the whole class started saying, just like we do. And we play polo, just like we do. And it's sort of like there's this little chant that went through the
Those kids have never played polo. Yes.
Anyway, I think one of the things that we're trying to demonstrate is that in a lot of our photography is trying to show that a lot of these stories are common themes, things that could take place anywhere in the world. We're also trying to celebrate local norms, and there's lots of things about our lives that are very different, and we're trying to find ways to embrace that as well. Everyday Africa now is a group of 35 photographers. But most of the active photographers, more than 50% of the contributing photographers are African. It is a mix of Africans and non-African photographers. We think that that's still important. We want to amplify local voices, but also find ways to bring in an outsider perspective as well. Both of those perspectives are important in telling the stories of this place. And we're also not trying to sort of say that, these stereotypes that you hear, the stories of crisis are not true. The problem with stereotypes is not that they're inaccurate, it's that they're incomplete. So there are photographs on Everyday Africa of children in refugee camps, like this one in the Congo. A man in Uganda who's been persecuted against because he's gay. A healthcare worker in Sierra Leone who died in the Ebola crisis. So these photographs and these stories are also a part of Everyday Africa. But instead of this picture, which maybe is the only picture you would see if you open a newspaper, you see these photographs next to the guy rollerblading or the marching band, and you get a far better, broader, deeper perspective of what life is like in that part of the world. Now, about a year after we started Everyday Africa, we started to notice some copycats. Now partners. There were some people early on who sort of said, you can find a way to franchise this, and that's never been the goal. The goal, we want this to sort of expand, mushroom, for people to repeat this idea on their own. So Everyday Asia, I think, was the first one maybe that we noticed that was copying the Everyday Africa idea. Everyday Middle East, Eastern Europe, Latin America. So this is the Everyday North Korea feed, and this is a recent screen grab that Peter got, because they recently stopped posting images. I'm not quite sure why, but North Korea's been in the news. Am I right about that? So in the commentary that some of the images that the feed has gotten, people are sort of saying, well, why not any more of these photographs, and what's going on? And then some business. So, it can also be topical. Everyday Bronx was the first feed that grew out of one of our education programs. We got some funding to do a project in the Bronx, working out of the Bronx Documentary Center with some middle school kids in that neighborhood. And we worked with them every Monday for 8 weeks. And we were able to sort of talk about stereotypes and truth in storytelling and journalism through Everyday Africa, but then turn the lens on them. And this has been something we've done repeatedly in these various education programs, and say, okay, well, here we are in the South Bronx. What are the stereotypes you guys are working with? Once on the south side of Chicago, on a trip with Mark, over there. I remember we were on the south side of Chicago, the two of us were together. Usually Peter does most of the Chicago stuff, but this time we were together, and I asked the kids, I was like, okay, so I've never been to the south side of Chicago. This is my first time here. What gangs are you guys in? And they were like, we're not in any gangs. I said, well, why do you think I think that? Well, that's because that's in the news, but that's not the true story. I said, well, take a camera, go out, and show me what the true story is. So that's the idea. And that's what we did with the kids in the Bronx, and they went out into the community, and they took pictures of their community, and then we have now managed to transition that project into the hands of local, professional, and skilled amateur photographers who have found a way to make this a very vibrant part of the everyday community.
That was another Pulitzer Center project.
Yes.
Pulitzer Center and OSF.
There are also issue-based feeds. It's not just geography. There's Everyday Black America. Everyday American Muslim. Zosha Minto is right here in the room. She started this project. The project predates the recent election, but on Instagram, sort of was born on Instagram right around the time of the election. And we're thrilled to have this to be a part of the family. And it's a really wonderful sort of insight into the American Muslim community. Everyday incarceration, which sometimes people automatically think must be photographs of people in prison. And it's less frequently that, but more frequently photographs of families who are impacted by having other family members in prison. Everyday climate change is a big one. Everyday migration. This is launching next month. Everyday extinction. So there's been a lot of ways that we've managed to sort of, it's not he and I aren't running these feeds. These are people who have these areas of interest and have started these feeds on their own. Anyone in this room could go out tonight and grab an Instagram handle and start one themselves. And that's how the project spreads. Everyday Everywhere is the sort of umbrella Instagram handle, and this is one that's curated, and so we sort of change off the curation every week or so. And it's a best of the various Instagram everyday feeds, but also a way to get to share the stories of people who are not official contributors. If you are on Instagram and you take a photograph that tells a good story and you can caption that, and it feels like something that fits into sort of the everyday ethos, and use that hashtag, then the curators will see that photograph and consider it for a part of that. And the Everyday Projects is our nonprofit umbrella community group that we're trying very hard to build.
Yeah. When people ask us, what do you guys do? We say it's a nonprofit umbrella community group. Yeah, now I've got the clicker, you can make jokes at me now. So I mean, the goal of the Everyday Projects has been to elevate localized storytellers in numerous underrepresented communities across the world, to promote visual literacy skills in students, in those storytellers, etc. So how do we do that? And of course, a huge part of it is that we've got this wonderful Instagram experiment in which we are going beyond the traditional gatekeepers and able to get the work straight out there ourselves. We've also done it quite a bit through traditional media. This is National Geographic from 3 years ago, I believe. And of course, that's just one of many examples of publications that Everyday Africa and many other Everyday Projects have been in worldwide. We have the curriculum, which basically follows what Austin already described. The students, we engage them in their thoughts about Africa. We use our photos to try to go beyond that, but then we also use it to spark this conversation about how they feel they are represented by media, and we use the Everyday Africa photography to teach angle, light, distance, color, all these kind of different basic elements of composition and photography, so that by the end they have their own everyday project. You can see that this is a screen grab from a website. This is not an education program that can only exist if Austin and I come into your classroom. This is something that is online and available for teachers to use. And we know quite a few teachers in places we have never visited who are making use of it. So that's been very exciting. 2.5 years ago, working with Pulitzer Center, we were able to go to Mombasa, Kenya, and do a week-long photo workshop with high school students there. And what was particularly exciting about that is that there was a simultaneous photography workshop happening in Chicago. And these students would Skype with each other periodically throughout the week, at times engaging in that discussion of how do they perceive each other, what are their stereotypes. We actually had them identify in advance their sort of perceptions of each other, and then they got on the phone and we made them talk through it, which was really fascinating and really insightful. I think for them as well as for us. And then as the week progressed, they started to share their photography with each other. So that's something we're hoping to do a lot more of. In some cases, we've been able, at the end of the classroom segment to revisit their changing perceptions of Africa. And so this is the same class that did bad, hunger, poverty, etc., with their list at the end of the class, which was things like strong, beautiful, unexpected, inspired, etc. And of course, by that time, they're sort of onto our game, that we're like trying to get them to, they know what we want to hear at that point. But at the same time, at least it sort of gets them thinking along these lines about these unexpected elements. Back to the ideas behind promoting localized storytelling. The African Photojournalism Database is our project in partnership with World Press Photo. Which is exactly that. It's many of you, I'm sure, know the platform Blink, which is basically an app through which editors can find photographers based on location when they need to hire a freelance photographer. So this is a database of photographers all over the continent, because of course the vast majority of sort of Western media assignments still go to people that look like us more than they go to African photographers. We just added 5 new, I'm about to get into talking about the book, and I always feel a bit bad doing that because we just added 5 more photographers who, because we just added them, their work is not in the book. So I want to recognize them really quickly. So Joanna is in Abidjan, finally, years after starting the project in Ivory Coast. We have an Ivorian contributor. Brian, JB, Brian Otieno, his Instagram handle is Kabira Stories. Brian is amazing. He is born and raised and still lives in the Kibera slum, which is the biggest slum on the continent. It's in Nairobi, possibly the biggest slum in the world, I'm not sure. And he just photographed his own community, joined Instagram, and now gets assignments all over Kenya as a result of that. Mahadir Tedesi, who is in Addis Ababa and runs a recently started Center for Photography in Ethiopia. Sarah Waiswa is a Ugandan living in Kenya, a very accomplished photographer. And Mustafa Saeed is in Somaliland. So now as we've, in the beginning this was all very sort of organic, which is like the nice way of saying haphazard and accidental. But now that we've sort of got this targeted way of growing the project, we're specifically adding photographers in places where we don't have much representation, we don't have other photographers based, and of course, over the last couple of years, we've only added more African photographers. So we're going to talk about the book now, which got one up here, there's copies somewhere floating around.
There's a desk out here.
Yeah, so we'll be selling and signing books after this, and there are not that many books left for sale in the world, which is totally mind-blowing to us. So if you want one, you should get one too. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how the book fits into our overall thrust of the project, and a little bit about the process of editing and creating that book. In a project that tries to engage, tries to really force us to look at how do we think about this continent, the Instagram comments seemed very important to us right off the bat. And I know that, like, the classic rule for anyone who publishes anything online is like, don't look at the comments, don't read the comments. It's the cesspool of the internet, like, don't pay attention. But with our project, we, because it is such a specific theme and thus in some ways a very specific audience, we were very interested in that. And especially in the beginning when it became clear that it was a lot of young people learning about the world for the first time. So, for example, before the book looked as great as it does now, I made a sketchbook in which I pasted photos and comments into the book and use that to sort of show it off to publishers and try to get them interested. So this one is a picture of kids playing jump rope. It's by the photographer Holly Pickett, and the comment that goes with it is, "Why are Africans treated so terrible? I'm sad." And we just could not wrap our brains around what about that picture would cause that response. Sometimes the comments are just straight up racism. This is one of my photos from Ivory Coast, and it says, "Look at the darkies." And then we started to notice this arc of familiarity as more Africans joined Instagram, more Africans followed our project. We started to see this shift in a lot of the commentary. So this one says, been there, want to be there, used to go there often. I have many great memories of my childhood there. I know these guys, and finally, oh my God, where did you find this? That's me. So journalism no longer operating in a vacuum. This is one we show often in classrooms. It's a photo by Nana Kofi Akwa, a Ghanaian photographer. And the caption below it says, "A little girl takes her bath before going to school in the morning." And someone comments and said, "It's a beautiful picture, but a sad context." And someone comments back saying, "Why is it sad? She's bathing, she's got clean water, she's out in the sunshine, and she's heading to school. Please stop assuming that because life looks different than yours, it's tragic." And we've always found that to be really important because it's just so nice when other people make your points for you. Austin was talking earlier about the kids saying, like, just like we do in the classroom, and I think it's really important that, a lot of people have actually been upset with us over the years that this isn't more like a PR project for the conference. But that's really not what it's about. It's not about only showing the just like us kind of, we could go to Africa and photograph shopping malls and fancy cars and things that would make it potentially look like the US. But there's also an element of that line. Stop assuming that because life looks different than yours, it's tragic. And I think that is equally, if not more important. But showing the sort of just like us stuff is the window through which we try to get the kids to adapt this sort of thing. We worked with an incredible designer on this book, Toon van der Heijden, who has done a number of fantastic books in the documentary photography world. And right away he looked at this and he was like, well, if you want to force people to engage with their own stereotypes, you can't put the Instagram comments right next to the photo. You have to separate them so that they form their own opinions of the pictures, and then by the time they are confronted with the comment, they've sort of formed their own opinion, and then they have to say, wait a second, what photo could have gone with that comment? So the whole book is this way, that it's a long section of photos, followed by a long section of Instagram comments. So you can see that jump rope picture again, and then later on you would get to, I hit the kill button. Later on you would get to why are Africans treated so horribly. Now, to not make it like completely terrible and confusing for people, we've added a little key, which is that each of the Instagram comments come with the hashtags that the photo was posted with originally, and each of the captions next to the photo have it. So it's sort of a little matching game. There we are at the Breda Photo Festival, where we almost got a second hotel room because we were like, let's just leave this and come back to it in the morning. But luckily we decided not to. We did find out later that Toon and his wife Sandra had a heart attack when we posted these online, because this was very near the end, and they were like, they're going to tell us they hate it and we should scrap the book. But this was us kind of laying out the whole book chapter by chapter and just having a final think about what is included here. And of course, Everyday Africa is in many ways a perfect title. It is also in many ways a problematic title. Whose everyday are we looking at? What does everyday mean? So one of the ways, in a sort of basic numbers game way, we have to think about diversity. So after Toon, with some input from Nana Kofi Akwa, made this sort of idealized edit of what the book should be, Toon did it without looking at any information behind the photo. He just did it in a purely visual sense. And so then we had to go through, and this is Austin's notebook, we had to go through and count them by country and count them by photographer and say, okay, there's a ton from Nigeria and none from Mauritania and whatever, and start switching them out and fighting with Toon and fighting with each other. But in the end, it was amazing because each time we did that, we thought, we're totally killing the book right now, it's going to be terrible. And then each time we would arrive at a solution that all three of us would be like, that's actually a lot better than it was before. So that was great. But interestingly, we also arrived at needing a diversity of subject matter and finding that certain things had been left out. For example, after Toon did his initial edit, we realized there was not a single picture of water in the book, or of collecting or fetching water, I should say. And anyone who has spent any time in, I was going to say rural Africa, but really anywhere in the continent knows that that is a huge part of daily life. Similarly, there was not a single mud hut in the book, which was like totally crazy to us, right? So we had to find a way to build a mud hut. And now, so a lot of what we just said we could have skipped entirely because the wonderful Stephen Mays wrote an afterword to the book that encapsulates so many of these themes so perfect. So Austin is going to read just a brief section of that essay.
There are 4 essays in this book. One is by Maza Mingiste, who's an Ethiopian-American novelist. She's amazing. Her essay is wonderful. She read it at our launch party in New York, and it's terrific. Nana wrote something very great, wonderful for us, the Ghanaian photographer. Peter and I wrote something very workmanlike to try to tell you how to read the book. And then at the end, as Peter was saying, this is by Stephen Mays, and it's a terrific piece, and I'm just going to read this short section. Approaching everyday Africa with misaligned expectations is disconcerting, much like looking through a telescope from the objective lens instead of the eyepiece. Where did everything go? Where is the Africa I know from every other photograph I've seen? This frustrated expectation is revealed in the anguished comments of Instagram viewers seeking to impose old world order on new world imagery. A child bathing in a puddle must represent poverty and can't only be seen as a specific child's enjoyment as they play in water, which, understood as a detail of individual experience, is common to rich and poor around the world. Our perspective has been so distorted by decades of strictly formatted media reporting on Africa that sometimes we can no longer see what we're looking at. The use of stereotype to tell the story of many by telling the story of a single symbolic figure has bred a blindness to the individual. And the legacy of this media trope is a confused tangle of conflicting perceptions. In the old way, individuals are obscured because they are seen to represent the lives of others. Removing the expectation of stereotype reveals individuals in a more personal light. In fact, symbols of distress that are traditionally assigned by photojournalists are not necessarily evident in the everyday lives of even the most anxious people. To an eye trained to seek cues of despair, significant social issues may not be apparent at all. It takes careful study to find refugees in these pages, or the hardship of unemployment, or the impact of HIV, homelessness, or homophobia. But it's all here, amidst the wedding anniversaries, the shopping lines, and the bathers. Stress and distress mingle with joy and fulfillment because they are embodied in the same people. The limitation of traditional reporting has been to assign a single role to each individual, whereas in life, we each know many roles.
And now we're just going to quickly, before we move to questions and chatting, a quick look into the future. So in the process of pulling Instagram comments into documents and editing them and thinking about them and how they could work in a book, it occurred to us that it may also be interesting to put them on stage and see what would happen when you stripped the anonymity of the internet away and had actors reading these face to face. So we've been experimenting with how Everyday Africa will work theatrically. And so we've done, at this point, two workshops, theater workshops. We, of course, when I say we've done, Austin and I have been pretty minimal in this compared to, we've had to bring in experts in these things. So we've had a director and a story architect working with teams of actors to kind of play with the material and come up with scenes. So we've done it once in New York, that's what this is, and once in Nairobi as part of a big book launch event that we did in Nairobi about 4 months ago, where we did a sort of big exhibition opening night and a performance of the theater work. So we are really hoping to kick that up in the next few months and also build it into the education space.
So thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Buy a book if you want to, or even if you don't. And we'd be happy to take questions.
Great, and let's just make sure the mic gets to you before you ask your questions so we can all benefit from it. Yes?
Good evening, gentlemen. I got a copy of the book, I guess, about 2 months ago. And my initial, when I went through it the first time, I was slightly disappointed. However, I have gone through it several more times. But my question, I think you partially answered my question. You mentioned that initially 50% of the photographers were Native Africans, and the other 50% were non-African photographers. Is that correct?
Now, most of the photographers are African photographers. In the book, it's close to 50-50.
Okay, and you also just said that you added 5 additional African photographers recently. I guess my real question is, and again, in my mind, and I understand the concept, I think you wanted to show images of Africa that we may not ordinarily normally see through mainstream and major media. I'm thinking that to do that, that you would in fact use Native Africans as photographers. And again, I know you said, it was kind of 50-50, but maybe in the future, you might consider evolving and doing a volume just solely of Native African photographers, because if you're a native of a particular country or particular of the continent, there's a different sensitivity in the images that you make as opposed to somebody who does not live in Africa. I mean, again, they can create images, but I'm just thinking there would be a different sensitivity of the images coming from those Native African photographers.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, well, I think just a few responses, and one is just to quickly clarify, if you were to scroll through the Instagram feed right now, almost every photo you see would be shot by an African photographer. So books are a different matter, but if you were to pull out the Instagram feed right now. And the other thing to clarify, I know this doesn't quite address what you're saying, but is that all of the photos were shot by people that live or have lived for extended periods of time. So even though they are not African, they are people who have lived there for years or more. But I think the final point to make to really fully address your question is that, I fully agree with you, and as we said, we're going in the future. I mean, the only photographers we've added to the project have been African for the last couple of years, if not more. And it would certainly, it would be certainly possible that the next book, speaking very optimistically that there is a next book, would be entirely made up of African images. But at the same time, and we talked about this a little bit before, we still believe in having both perspectives. I mean, the all-time greatest photo book of the United States was made by Robert Frank, who is Swiss. I mean, that's not quite the same thing, but it's basically what I'm getting at is that I think while you're right that people that are born and raised and lived in and from a country have a certain type of insight, if nothing else, I think people that also have the fresh eyes of coming in from elsewhere offer something as well. And we were just proponents of blending those two things.
Over here.
Hi, so I've really enjoyed this. And just your first slide really struck me. I do work in unconscious bias, and thinking about kind of these first words that come to mind when a child thinks about Africa. And I wanted to ask you both, were there any sort of biases that you entered into this project that were kind of shattered through this work?
For ourselves. Well, I think one of the things that's important about that is that we were in Ivory Coast. The trip that took us there from whence this project was born was a story to work on crisis. It was a story about a country trying to emerge from crisis. And the birth of the project was really a reaction against that. The crisis was a real story. The crisis was an unreported story. It was something that really, in a journalistic sense, needed to be talked about. And yet the frustration was that, here we were sort of piling on, more stories of the same kind of thing. I think one of the reasons that 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 hit us is because of the fact that it wasn't our first time in that part of the world. I had lived in Ivory Coast for 4 years. Peter had lived in Ghana for 4 years. We had both traveled throughout the continent doing a lot of other reporting. So we knew, even as we were looking, I was looking to interview refugees and former child soldiers, and he was looking to photograph those kinds of things. We also knew that if you sort of looked around, what you saw for the vast majority of the people was that life was pretty normal. So it was a reaction against that very thing. And so in that way, it was a sort of a new opportunity to shed light on this thing that we knew was there that was always so hard to see.
I'm trying to think of more specific examples for your question beyond that, and I'm sure I'll think of the perfect one at midnight tonight. But one thing that strikes me as far as things I realized through the process of this project is my own relationship with media as a photographer and with the sort of gatekeeper model. This specific instance was that Newsweek Japan did a photo essay on Everyday Africa, and they did it by having a map of the continent, and then they would have the photos sort of like coming out with an arrow from each country they were from. And they only did one photo per country. And they asked for the photos, and I just sent them the photos, because an editor asks you to do something, you just do it, especially when you're a young, frightened, I'm never going to work again if I don't comply with the photographer. The Nigerian photographer, the Nigerian photograph in this case was, I forget the name of it, but it's Makoko. It's this one that is on stilts. And so it's all these like sort of hovels on stilts, and it's this kid sort of like poling on a boat through it. And a Nigerian photographer that's in our group reached out to me and basically had this like, how dare you kind of attitude. It's like, they asked for one photo to represent my country, and you just complied with it. And I was so apologetic, and I've thought a lot since then about I mean, obviously I was thinking quite a bit about media representation already, but thinking more about having control of our images and sort of the responsibility of that.
How do you control them when they're being fed?
Jamie, put your hand up. Wait.
Let's get to that
microphone. Thank you both for the presentation, wildly provocative, and love the dialogue you started. But yeah, the whole curatorial thing has always been damning in a way. But the Instagram feed is anyone can put up, or you have to vet the people who have been part of Everyday Africa?
There's no curation.
Here I think I said. No curation.
There's no curation for Everyday Africa. Now, not every everyday feed is the same.
Right.
Some of them are run in different ways. And the Everyday Everywhere feed is curated. But for Everyday Africa, we have this set of contributing photographers. They all have the login information. We have spent a lot of time looking for people and trying to find people who have the sensibility that fits in with what we're all about. And the only rule is give each picture some time to breathe. If you put a picture up, don't put another one up right away. Let each one, sit there for a few hours before the next one goes up. Now, does that mean, sure, that does mean that from time to time I might see an image on the feed that I'll think, that's not ideal. But the overall effect is one of this sort of chaos is the wrong word, but it's just it's organic.
Yeah, people respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's part of what people respond to is the fact that that I think you can tell that it's not curated. It's.
But do people try to take advantage of that and in any way sully it? I mean,
not yet.
There are unresolved issues in all the world. Specifically in Everyday Africa, isn't that used as a tool by people who don't have that genuine outpouring?
Not yet. We haven't had that problem. I mean, we also try to use the hashtag, the Everyday Africa hashtag, as a way of sharing photography by others who have posted a photograph on their feed with that hashtag, and we will try to share that on Fridays as a way of expanding the reach beyond just the official photographers. But we haven't had any trolling of that sort.
It's interesting. No, thank you for what you do. It's a time and place where control of information is never more.
One thing that's sort of related, and this goes back to sort of inner editing, internal editing, is that I've asked some of the photographers in the past year or so, like, is there an image that you think of as an Everyday Africa photograph? and some of them are now saying that they, we've always encouraged them, like, shoot throughout your day, nothing's off limits, post the poverty and the richness and, whatever. But now I think some of them just mentally there's this shift of like, well, now I can't describe an everyday Africa photo, but I know it when I see it, and like that's what I post. And that's almost self-defeating in its own way for this to become like a genre of photography. So I'm a bit worried of that too.
Is every country represented in the book? No.
I think it's 40. I think it's in 40 countries. So we did not have every single country, but most of them.
And then when you were saying the process of editing and you realized there was a mud hut missing, did you go through the feed to find that, or did you reach out to the photographers and say, do you have this picture?
Oh no, that's actually a good question. I mean, all that stuff was already on the feed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Going back to the Everyday DC project and the project that you guys have been doing with the DC public schools, what have you found have been some of the biases that they're trying to defeat, and how are they doing that?
Feel that?
Yeah, Christy, if you think of any, feel free to jump in. I think that one of the interesting things, the teachers are also looking to assess, are they understanding the visual literacy component and the responsibility of taking photographs with a journalistic assignment of sharing everyday life. So they were looking at those final pictures to see that. I think that in the discussions, when we start with lesson 1 and move into what stereotypes do you think, and not even, actually we don't say what stereotypes do you think people have about DC, we say if I Googled DC, what would come up? And is that representative of what you would see in your everyday life? And what I think at Johnson today, Austin, they brought up violence, they brought up police brutality, as
Touristy stuff, monuments.
So that spectrum, so the touristy stuff, and then depending on the school, talking about violence. And I think that then what we saw in the exhibit, which is where we're kind of doing our assessment, are they understanding through this image and caption what the mission of this is, that actually, I think the curators who selected those photos and pulled them together and put them and named the walls really got it. There was a wall called Community. There was a wall called what's that one with all the transportation called? I think was it called Transportation? There was this one called Our Art, where the curators were really inspired just by shape and just different. It was a lot of sculpture and a lot of buildings, but were those photographers really interested in angle? So I think that they were looking to I think that a lot of what the learning was moving away from the tourism and the violence and news around the danger of DC to, there was a lot of joy in the images, and definitely clear from our assessment, the students understood that these images were for an audience, where the idea was to share their everyday life. Maybe that's why we had so many buses. A lot of buses, an entire wall of buses. You have a question up here? Maybe we'll go here first, and this will be our next question over here.
Hi guys, this is a really brilliant presentation. I'm really personally excited about how you're choosing to use your platform. My question is in reference to a project I'm doing right now about harassment on social media online. And so I think your choice to use Instagram as a platform obviously has a lot of implications. And I'm curious about, when you're looking at the ratio of comments, how many of them are positive, how many of them are negative? And going from there to the negative comments, are they helpful, are they harmful? And if you don't get that many negative comments, why do you think that this project lends itself to that? Because really, harassment online is a really serious issue.
How much time for that? I mean, we were just very embedded in the comments for a very long time, and yeah, I mean, I think it's first of all, it's been interesting. I mean, I think part of the reason it was we didn't know this at the time, but it ended up being very necessary to do this book now, is that the algorithms behind it, Instagram have changed. There was a Wired article just a week or two ago that Kevin Systrom is using algorithms to clean up the internet, kind of thing, like trying to pre-edit out trolls and harassment and profanity from Instagram comments, which is interesting and frightening in the way that algorithms controlling content is interesting and frightening. And it was interesting for us because in the last year or maybe more, we've kind of been like, we used to get a lot of interesting arguments and debates and a lot of middle fingers, and we don't anymore that much. And we started to think like maybe it's like big enough now that the audience it attracts is only an audience that just wants to say great picture and move on. Now we just get a lot of like beautiful picture kind of stuff, and we don't know. Maybe actually the reason we don't get any of that other stuff is because like Instagram has been working behind the scenes to remove it, which is fascinating. But so I would say a couple of years ago, there was a lot. It's hard to ascribe a percentage or guess at a percentage, positive versus negative. I will say this is worth clarifying that look at the Darkies comment was actually when we were taking over the New Yorker's Instagram feed. It's not from the Everyday Africa feed. I would say we get a lot less like straight up racism. Again, I think because like, why would you follow Everyday Africa if you just want to, say racial stuff? Yeah, I mean that's just much stuff off the top of my head.
The other thing I would say is that we're choosing from 3,000 photographs to make a book that ended up being 267 photographs long. And you want to find room in there to feature the images and the commentary in a way that's interesting and compelling and forces a deeper dive into this perception. But you can't include it all. So there's a definite curatorial element to that. So we had to be careful if we could easily have just included a lot of negative stuff, and then it would have just been this sort of horribly depressing, dark experience of the trolls and all this stuff. And it also would not be reflective of what the comments really are, because it really is this mix of stuff that is negative and is racist, but also sometimes is simply ignorant, or is very do-gooder, or is just funny. Oh my God, that's me. People making jokes. I mean, so we wanted to include a mix of that stuff, not only because it's reflective of what the feed's really like, but also, just to provide a bit of levity along the way as you're presenting the material.
And for your project, you really need to see the book Weight Watcher. I forget what she called the book in the end, but Haley Morris, who knows this book? Gina, you own this book? You own every book there? Anyways, it's a woman who is quite heavy, and when her work was published online, she did self-portraits of herself in public.
Googling?
Yeah.
Anyways,
she did. I think the project was called Weight Watchers, and she called the book Watchers or something. But she did these self-portraits of herself, and people reacting to her. And when she published them, a lot of the comments, she would publish them on news websites. And some of the comments would be like, "Oh my God, you're so brave!" People identifying with her, and then other ones were like, "You're a fat pig, why do you go out in public?" And then she made a book that included both of these things in a way that is really fascinating. There's my fun part.
We've got one more question, and then we'll have to continue the conversation outside. Is it one over here? Yes. Let's all get a bit. We all want to hear it.
I just had a question about how invested you are in collaboration when all of these other everyday projects come up. And then secondly, I love the Everyday DC exhibition that you did. I went there, but I think it'd be so cool to do it all over the world. And how scalable do you think that operation is? And how does the nonprofit really done?
Yeah, I mean that's right. I mean when it starts raining money, that's what we'll do. No, that's actually very much the goal of the nonprofit. Not just be a sort of umbrella project for all everyday feeds, but when we think about growth of the nonprofit, it is to education programs, especially adding in that classroom Skyping element, which can be done in numerous places, and then you can do the exhibitions and so on and so forth. So that's a big part.
We had a lot of the everyday projects together with us at Photoville in New York a couple of years ago. That was the first time we managed to get together and see each other face to face and meet and talking about some of these things. Recently in Nairobi, a lot of the Everyday Africa photographers got together for the first time and also had this meeting and talked about future plans and all of that along with the book launch and the theater work. So those ideas, those kinds of ways of thinking about it sort of world is that, world domination is our goal. But yeah, finding ways to sort of do that kind of thing, replicate that.
And you asked about like how, so I mean, what Austin and I do really is like numerous ways of trying to build out Everyday Africa and this sort of overall nonprofit. But as far as like the stuff we do for Everyday Africa, we don't do specifically for Everyday Asia and Everyday Middle East because there's not enough hours in the day. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and then they have sort of like Everyday Middle East has their own sort of versions of us, who is like thinking about new contributors and
Exhibitions.
yeah, exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Well, we know them, and we are in semi-regular contact, and they're coming to us for advice and blah blah blah.
Like people have asked if they're, what's the next book? We know that the people who are working on Everyday Australia and Everyday Guatemala are currently working on books. And so that's another example. I mean, they reached out to us to sort of ask a few questions, and what do you think about this idea? And we're always here to sort of like, provide that kind of support while trying not to dictate anything. We want them to do the project that makes the most sense for them. So we do have a dream of having a bookshelf with all these everyday books.
And we can help by following the new website and checking out all the feeds. We also hope that you'll stay in touch with us by signing up for the Pulitzer Center newsletter. We also have an education newsletter for your educator community out there. And we hope that this conversation continues over some book buying and book signing. So thank you all so much for coming. A round of applause for yourselves. And all the
Table right out here with some books, and we'll be sitting there ready to sign a book.